Okay, well, so I've just stuck to the title of the paper, Causality and Explanation. I do think we can learn so much from the wider social sciences, and I appreciate as a early career researcher, there's so much you need to know. You need to know your empirical domain, you need to know the precise theory, but there is also so much knowledge and experience in the wider social sciences that we as a field can benefit from. Because we're not the only ones that have thought about how big, long-term, complicated, multi-actor change comes about, Historians, sociologists, political scientists have, of course, also thought about these things for many decades. So I think this paper partly tries to build on the wealth of knowledge that already exists in the social sciences, and I think we can benefit from that. So the structure also stays quite close to the paper: introduction, philosophy of science, causality, explanation, conclusions. So the introduction, in my reading of the field, these things are always, it makes sense to maybe distinguish a first wave of transition research and a second wave. So the first wave is just basically establishing the phenomenon that there is something such as transitions, which was not a common term. Of course, there was talk about technological discontinuities and techno-economic paradigm shifts. And of course, there were other people, Schumpeter and others, that have thought about discontinuities, but socio-technical system transitions or system transitions did not exist as a phenomenon. So one thing was to basically establish that there is something interesting there, then develop some analytical frameworks to make some sense of it. The multi-level perspective, a technological innovation system, strategic niche management are sort of the first wave conceptual frameworks. Mostly then the empirical stuff is often single case studies, often longitudinal, basically to show that these frameworks offer something useful to explain long-term transitions or the emergence of innovations. So that's the first wave, roughly 15 years. I think for the last couple of years, we've been going, or this has started for more like a second wave. Of course, there's also still first wave stuff happening, but I do see in the field the explicit attempts to systematize the kind of concepts we have, reflect on them a bit deeper. Are they the only concepts? Do we need other concepts? I think there's a real attempt now to draw more explicitly on particular disciplines, what a business studies got to offer, what has got political science got to offer, what a cultural discourse theory. There's all kind of attempts to systematize, to bring in, established theories from other fields into our own field. There have been criticisms, of course, on the frameworks we use. There are attempts to elaborate them. We're also finding new empirical topics, destabilization and decline. How does acceleration happen, or diffusion, or what about politics and power struggle? I think there's a whole range of interesting empirical topics within the wider transitions field, which then lead to new kind of questions. But also part, I think, of the second wave is now these more foundational reflections on, what are we actually doing, and what is there something specific about the phenomenon that we are studying in terms of methodology and epistemology. So I think we're also now at sort of a phase of not soul searching, but more like deeper reflection on what we are doing and why and how can we do it better. So I'll be focusing a bit more. The paper focuses on that last point, on epistemological criticisms. These are some of the papers that have emerged recently: Sorel, Svensson and Nicoleris, Papachristos, Alvega. I think some of them will be speaking in this whole series as well. Of course, they make a whole bunch of points, but the paper focuses on these three criticisms: that process, because I initially characterized what we do as process theory. And they say, well, that's not really theory, that's not really explanation. What you do is just superficial, you just look at the events, and that's not proper explanation. And most of these critics that I mentioned here say that critical realism provides a better ontology than process theory. And I don't disagree with them. I think critical realism is actually very good. I think it's very compatible with process theory, as I will show later. I think they used the wrong version of critical realism. So the second thing that has been criticized is theories as heuristic device. And they say, well, that's not the same as causal explanation. What you need is explanatory theories. And I think that that point really betrays their own sort of positivist backgrounds, even though they're not aware of it. So I will also show there are different views on the role of theory in explanation, and that they only adhere to one of them, and there's other options as well. And they also say there's too much qualitative case studies, and that's not rigorous. In order to advance transition research, should do more quantitative research, more rigorous, more focused, and particularly we should do modeling, because that's the only way to true knowledge. So, as I said, I think these criticisms, or these kinds of criticisms, are kind of, we should welcome them as a field, as an opportunity to reflect on what we're doing and why. And as I've tried to do in the paper, actually legitimize or think a bit deeper about the kind of causality and explanation that we offer. And I came across this nice paper, Hirsch and Levin, who say this is actually quite normal in any sort of research field, how it develops. That initially this excitement, of broad ideas and frameworks by the umbrella advocates, as they use it. So that's how you could see the first wave of transitions research. This is then followed by criticism from the validity police, who say, but that's not real explanation, and should define your constructs a lot better, and how you're going to operationalize the various concepts that you have. It's all unclear. So then the third step could be either you start elaborating what you're doing or explaining, or you fail to do that, and then the whole field collapses. I think there are also examples of fields which are fashionable for a time, but then actually don't manage to advance further conceptually, empirically, and methodologically. Or maybe we should just at some point have a deeper awareness that there will be always different epistemological trade-offs between depth, scope, and speed, or different kind of explanatory ambitions. So the goal of the paper is to provide a deeper, more systematic discussion of epistemological foundations. So as I said, I've used the criticism as an opportunity to think a bit more deeply about what we're doing and why, in my view. And the main point is to say, I'm trying in the first paper, I was very defensive and very negative, and I said these critics, they just got it all wrong. They're just, they're just normal scientists. They can't see what we do and why it's special. So partly stimulated by the reviewers, I've now toned it down and said, well, actually there's different styles, and of course there is scope, for positivist methods and regression analysis. I think it doesn't quite do justice to the phenomenon, but I'm trying to just say there are different styles. I think that's one of the pitch of the paper, and that's also why I brought in these philosophies of science. So the starting assumption basically of the paper is there is not one right way of doing science. Contrary, that's not how we brought up in when you go through your studies, and usually in your PhD training as well, you are being taught, this is the way to do it. This is normal science. This is what proper science is, and everything else is not quite proper, not quite rigorous. So I try to acknowledge that is one way of doing things, but I also try to say, well, there's different styles. And I think you need to choose the style for the particular topic. If you do very narrow, precise kind of questions, then probably you don't need the kind of things that we're doing, then positivism is fine. But I think my point, and I don't feel this is addressed well enough by the critics, is that transitions are a particular kind of topic that really poses fundamental challenges for normal science. So one is the temporality of longitudinal processes, 30, 40, 50 years. And actually the whole interest is how the process progresses over time. It's not just input, output, starting point, outcome. It's the whole, what happens in between, and ups and downs and twists and turns and different patterns in different countries. I think that's what interests me. So it's not just, from beginning to end, but actually the whole process of how it evolves. The entities themselves are heterogeneous, socio-technical systems. How do you bound them? It's really, it's got multiple dimensions, technical, economic, infrastructure, but also it really depends where the bounding, what you find interesting. The mobility system, You could also say, well, mobility currently essentially depends on oil. Oil flows around the world. Most of it comes from the Middle East. That's why the United States also has all these military bases around in Saudi Arabia and the Strait of Suez. So there's a close interconnection between the military and the transport regime. If that's your focus, and if you do a really interesting question and you focus, then that's fine. So how you bound a transport system or a food system or an electricity system, that depends on your research question. So it's a really, and you may say, well, that's fuzzy, I don't like that. Good, that's your choice. You could also say, well, this is a different kind of topic than the standard kind of what social science normally does. And then the other thing is the entities themselves, so the actors, but also the system elements, change themselves in the transition process. So it's not like the same thing. It depends on whether you see actors as doing something and changing themselves over time, or if you see actors as having properties, and the properties are just the variables. It's only the variables that change. So I do think transitions are quite different from normal science. And I do think that warrants a special kind of epistemological approach. And that's one of the main pitches. Even though I speak about the other styles as well, I do think the other styles have limitations in what they can do. Of course, the styles that I advocate also have limitations, which I will also talk about. So how does the paper work? It mobilizes insights from wider social science. As I say, we're not the only ones that have studied these kind of issues. History, historical sociology, political science, organization studies. There's a lot of other disciplines that have thought about how to explain big, multidimensional, long-term change. And interestingly, I think if you read widely in the other disciplines, there seems, in my reading, and I'm not the only one, a wider epistemological debate, revolution even happening in thinking about change and explanation and causality. Not just in transition studies, but more broadly. And in the paper, I've got this table with some quotes from all the disciplines. I've got some quotes here, selected from that table. There's one from Peter Hall about political science, saying that it moved away from this ontologies with causal variables and is now focusing on extensive endogeneity, path dependence, and the ubiquity of complex interaction effects. Consequently, parsimony is no longer seen as a key feature of explanation in political science. So that's in political science. Then Tilly, who's a historical sociology, he says in social science more generally, there's a substantial intellectual movement around mechanism and process-based explanations. And then Leisering and Walking talk about an intellectual revolution, which is about thinking dynamically. So there is a lot going on, I think, in the wider social sciences, where actually the normal science idea is being criticized as being too narrow. So the paper talks about these three foundational issues. I just started with the philosophy of science assumptions, then about causality, and then about explanation. Philosophies of science, you will all have seen probably this table in the paper, so I don't have time to go through all of them, but I distinguish 5 basic philosophies of science. Positivism, and I'll say more about that. Interpretivism, which is not so interested in explanation and causality. It just says reality is socially constructed. And it says that it explicitly says we don't want causality and causes. We want to understand actors' reasons. So it's much more qualitative methods. It does not have much to say about causation. Critical realism, I'll also say more about that. And I think that is absolutely how I see my own work as well, fitting very nicely with that. So I don't have a problem with the critics advocating critical realism. Pragmatism has got a much more instrumental view of causation, because it's basically interested in how can we bring about the effects of causes. And then there's also postmodernism, which is very much about deconstruction and giving voice to the actors that are being ignored, showing multiplicity, which are important to do as a philosophy of science, and it's good to have in our field as well. But I don't think it has much to say about causality and explanation. So the paper focuses on 3 of these philosophies of science. Positivism is the dominant model, particularly in natural science. It has also been transposed to the social sciences. So many social scientists say, well, because natural science works so well, that's the model that works. So we should do it as well in social science. These are particularly economists, psychologists, people that really tend to focus on single actors and how to make decisions. They often tend to be attracted to this positivism model. Positivism focuses only on those things that you can measure and observe. That's the whole idea. It's measurable. So they don't like ideas as belief or interpretations or interests or all these sort of fuzzy, they're like hard things, money, amounts, things that you can calculate and add up. That's what they focus on. Measurable things, that's what they focus on. The view on causation is nomothetic. There are laws. It assumes the world is made up of laws, which are seen as constant conjunctions, things that regularly repeat together. Their view on theory is how most of us are being brought up, as a good theory should be universal, formalized, axiomatic, and logical statements. So basically you start with the beginning of an assumption of how the world works, and then all the rest should logically follow from that. That's their view about what a theory is. And that's not the only view on theory. Let me be clear about that. Explanation then means, well, you just need to subsume a topic under a general law, or law like regularities. So my evaluation is that this is of not so much use for socio-technical transitions. It is widely used in economics, in psychology, in integrated assessment models. So I'm very aware that there is a wider community out there which also studies transitions and probably is a bigger community than we are, but they tend to focus on techno-economic transitions. They're not so interested in the social and the cultural dimensions of transitions. Pragmatism, as a philosophy of science, I'm quite keen actually, or interested in pragmatism, because it just focuses on people and how they go about their daily life and how they actually solve practical problems, just like we as researchers are. I also like their view, basically, that theories are not true. There's no point talking about the true theory. It's better to see theories as more or less useful for your research question, for policy, for particular actions. So their view is also good explanation is not about truth, or good explanation should enable intervention. So that becomes much more instrumental than an instrumental view of theory, instrumental approach to causation. You're basically interested in achieving particular effects. So therefore you want to have causes that you can manipulate in order to bring those effects about. And that can either be in terms of variables in the experiments as a concrete form, and in a more abstract form is about statistical correlations between variables. And my evaluation of that strand of research is it is used increasingly, not so much in TIS and SNM and MLP, but there are lots of people that are doing this kind of research. It is useful for particular kind of questions. If you want to study the role of the European emissions trading system on the adoption of technologies or particular R&D strategies, well, you can make a big database of all kind of companies in a particular sector, and then you can make regression analysis and come up with some kind of answer about how big the effect was. That's useful, but it's quite narrowly focused questions that it can answer. I don't think it can say something about transitions in the broader sense, but we don't all need to do that. So it's a valid and interesting research program. Critical realism is quite a different, it's a philosophy of science with a different view of science and reality. So it sees the world as layered. What we see are the events, that's the empirical, but underlying that are the actual and the real. So that's so the events are caused by mechanisms, and the mechanisms themselves relate back to structures. So basically this picture shows that. Surface events are actively produced by entities, so that's actors, who interact with each other in particular structures mediated by causal mechanisms. I think as a philosophy of science that's quite useful and actually resonates quite well with what TIS is doing and SNM and MLP. So I have no problem. I think this is a very useful philosophy of science. But when I started reading more deeply about critical realism, I do think there are two versions of it. One by Bhaskar, but also closely followed by Sorel and some of the other critics, is very objectivist and formal and structural. It tries to bring everything down to the causal powers of entities, which are almost like intrinsic or given. And then those causal powers just activate themselves, leading to outcomes. And I don't think that's very well able to actually explain transition specificities, as I set out before. But then there's also another version of critical realism, much more agentic, looking at agents and interactions and processual. And that's where causal powers are actualized in social action and interaction. There's still a lot of agency. It's always situated, and the context in which actions happen are quite important in bringing about the effects. So I think that's more suitable to what, in my view, what I'm doing or what transition research is doing. So that's all I wanted to say about the philosophy of science. The paper says more about it. I'll try to speed up a little bit. I've got a few slides on causality and then a few on explanation, and then we're done. So on causality, I think there's three views linked to those different philosophies of science. Positivism, basically, it has got sort of a black box view of causality. It's actually not particularly interested in causality. It's almost about correlation. And as you know, it's always been criticized, correlation is not causation, but basically positivism is not so interested in causation. It just wants to see when two variables, when two events occur together, is there a law that links them? You know, that's sufficient to be able to calculate. You just need to establish the law and then you can do explanation. Pragmatism is got a different view on causality, which some people call push type of causality. So you break the world into variables, not actors, but variables. So Abbott has written nicely about this, Van der Ven, a whole range of scholars. It's basically the view, as we're all brought up, you know, you got dependent variables and independent variables. So you got what you need to explain is the effect, you call that the dependent variable, and you try to establish which are the causes, the independent variables that cause this. And the method that goes with it is statistical analysis of large data sets. So you just need to collect, you know, hundreds, if not thousands, of the same phenomenon that you're interested in, and then you can analyze which factors were causing the effect. Critical realism has got a different view on causality. It's really interested more about the how of causation. So how outcomes are generated by actors that interact in particular structures, which are mediated by causal mechanisms. And this can either take a really simple form of linear causality. So my point is all the examples in Steve Sorrell's paper are all simple cases, which have nothing to do with transitions, are completely useless in my view. So we got examples about a baseball breaking a window. That's how he illustrates causality, because the properties of the baseballs, it's got a certain kind of hardness, it's got a certain speed. Going to the window is characterized by the window has certain brittleness properties, and if the brittleness and the ball interact, then it breaks. I think, well, what the fuck's interesting about this? Why is this useful for transitions? So, but anyway, that's how he explains his view about how we should do explanation. You know, and if you're interested in that, please go ahead. I don't see anything interesting in that way of thinking about change. So there is a whole literature not on linear causality, but on complex causalities. And I thought that's really interesting. That's a really, you know, that's how many of these historians, political scientists think about. So I've categorized them into 3 or 4 different kinds of complex causalities. So one is, and I've organized them, maybe not entirely surprisingly, that they do resonate relatively well with the multi-level perspective. So one is conjunctural causality. That's in a way the highest level, or the most aggregate, the most aggregate way of looking at change. So that tries to say, well, outcomes are generated when relatively independent conditions, processes, or forces come together. So it's not like simple cause and effect, it's more different layers of kind of processes that come together. This is typically how historians explain change, but also I think the MLP basically alignments between processes at multiple levels. And this literature often talks about different temporalities as well. So this is quite a nice quote from Sewell. I mean, Sewell is really a really good historian, if you want to read, because most historians are also not so interested in theory or explanation. They just do what they do. They just seem to be brought up in a certain way. But Sewell is a historian that has really reflected quite deeply on explanation and what historians actually do when they explain and describe historical processes. So he says one significant characteristic of historical events, I mean historical processes, is that they always combine social processes with very different temporalities, relatively gradual and long-run social trends, more volatile swings of public opinion, punctual accidental happenings, medium-run political strategies, sudden individual decisions, oscillating economic and climate rhythms, which are brought together in specific ways at specific places at times in a particular sequence. So that's typically also how I see the MLP as explaining change. You've got these long macro things, you've got regime conjunctures or temporalities, and you've got niche events. Historians, for instance, look at World War I. You know, how was World War I? How do you explain that? Of course, it was triggered by the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, who was killed in Sarajevo. That was the immediate trigger. But the trigger event could only have effects because there were pre-existing coalitions between Russia and France and Austria and the UK and other countries. And they all had these coalitions saying, if one of us is being attacked, then we help each other, and we all help our allies. And these coalitions themselves were embedded in a wider arms race, into wider economic competition. This was also the time that the UK was declining as an economic power as part of the late 19th century, early 20th century. Germany was in the rise because of modernization and industrialization. So it's all these things coming together, the big trends, the small trends, and then a particular incident can have a big effect. So I think that's how historians try to explain how big things happen. So that's typically conjunctural causality, different temporal levels. The second layer is more configurational causality, where different causal chains or factors are coming together. So in the previous one, it was sort of independent things coming together. Here it is really much more, as this quote says, a specific mode of explanation in which researchers consider how multiple factors combine to form larger combinations, complexes, and causal packages. So these Taylor and Mahoney are also interesting to read. They're political scientists. And then this historical sociologist, Amin Saad, which I recommended an article from, says that most historical sociologists reject the notion of a single master process, acknowledging instead multiple processes that overlap and intersect one another. Explaining a particular outcome thus involves a particular logic of explanation, situating events or outcomes in terms of their location in intersecting trajectories. So I think the MLP, this kind of idea of co-evolution between the multiple trajectories at the regime level, or you can do the same at the niche level, if you will, where you've got event change and trajectories, but these trajectories are co-evolving with each other. It's an example of trying to do this configurational kind of explanation. Then the third layer of explanation is event chain causalities, that's zooming in a bit further. So Sewell again says the common topic of historians is the unfolding of human action through time. Every act is part of a sequence of actions, and its effects are profoundly dependent upon its place in the sequence. So this is where you really try to zoom in the processes over time and how they unfold. And it's not just about input, output, or beginning or end, but really, twists and turns and ups and downs and how actors respond to each other, the struggles, the moves, the counter moves. It's that kind of way of explaining change. This is a very broad school of thinking in which there are many sub-varieties, self-reinforcing cycles, path dependence or reactive. You also have people that say it's about how actors experience the events. So if they're in an event, it changes their experience, their views, their interests, their powers. And then you can also, Van der Ven in particular, you can think about different structural forms of progression. So these are just some of the figures of how you can think about them. I think that's really interesting. I've not done this systematically myself, but this looks like a really interesting way of maybe thinking about change, how we can structure these events and event sequence in a way to explain change. For the sake of time, I'll just won't go through everything in detail. And then the last layer of or granularity of explanation is causal mechanisms. This has really been an exploding literature in the last 15 years. The multiple definitions of causal mechanisms, and there's no agreement in the literature about which one is the best. So in the paper, I also don't try to give one explanation. I basically just try to link it back to these two views on critical realism, where either you see mechanisms as sort of quite mechanical, the nuts and bolts of change, or you look more at actors, struggles, recurring activities, those kind of things. And in some of my more theoretical work, I've tried to sort of work with that kind of idea, how the events, which is more at the field level, how you can break them down into different mechanisms. Now, this is based on the work morphogenetic cycles, structural conditioning, social interactions, elaboration, institutionalization. It's easier to do theoretically than to do it empirically. So again, this is, somewhere where maybe the theory is a bit ahead of what we're doing empirically, but there is a whole, in our field more generally, I think we have now a very big toolbox of mechanisms that we can play with. So I think, and actually looking back at a chapter that I did with Johan in 2010, there we already suggested that there are three sort of granular layers of explanation. And I think this conjuncture and configurational causality works quite well if you want to explain whole transitions, so the whole 40, 50-year process. If you want to explain more particular trajectories, you may want to look at event chain causality. And then you can zoom in further if you want to explain particular events. So there are, I think, which kind of explanation or view on causality you use depends on what you want to explain. And there's no explanation of everything. It's really driven by the questions and the puzzles and the topics that you have. Then the last bit about explanation, the role of theory. I've just got one slide on each philosophy of science. So positivism, as I said earlier, they try to explain by identifying laws and just showing how a topic can be explained by activating a particular law. Their view on theory or explanatory theory, as Sorel and others, I think they really implicitly have this in mind, that the theory needs to be general, so it applies everywhere, no matter what the condition is or the context. It's unambiguous, so it's clearly measurable and operationalizable. It's parsimonious, so simple rather than complex. It's formal, by which they mean it can be quantified, and it is logical. So theory is basically seen as a set of logically related statements. That's how I read their criticism, that this is what they want transition theory to be. If they ask for explanatory theory, they never concretely indicate what this would look like. But I think implicitly this is what they have in mind. And that sounds great. I have no idea what it would mean for transitions. I have no idea how you could operationalize this in a sensible way. Maybe it works nicely if you want to explain how baseballs break windows, as Sorel does, but I don't see any usefulness in explaining transitions in this kind of way. So I do look forward from the critics to see what kind of explanatory theory they actually come up with. So I think this kind of way of explaining also is not interested in anything empirical, concrete. They don't want to explain specific events. They don't want to explain the electricity transition in Germany or the one in the UK. They're interested in a class of phenomena rather than specific events. And this quote says nicely, "The goal of theoretical analysis is the model and not the one-to-one reflection of reality. In other words, the objective is not to describe minutely a situation given in reality in all its details, but to focus on what one deems the most important aspects of the situation." And there's something admirable in that. There's not, I do think we should not get too drowned in details, but somehow we need to, I think, find the middle way between details and sort of too abstract kind of theory. So then the second one, statistical explanation, which is, I think, even more dominant. Well, the other one's more dominant in the modeling well, not the modeling, because there are many different types of models. Let's say the integrated assessment modeling or the economic modeling. In the paper, I try actually to be, and this was stimulated by Papachristos and also by some of Jonathan's papers, that there are different kind of models. And I think in my earlier work, maybe I was too simple and say there's, positivism is modeling. And that's not true, there's different kind of models. So, but this way of explaining is almost even more dominant, I think, particularly in the social sciences. And it's nicely portrayed in this figure on the left-hand corner. I mean, the example is about strategy, it doesn't really matter what the example is, but it is something you want to explain, which is here the extent of strategic change, which is the dependent variable y. And you just want to know, how is it caused? What is the relative importance of different variables? Environment, leadership, decision processes, performance. And then you use a big data set, and you can do regression analysis, other statistical techniques to try to come up with a quantitative answer. So theories are not so important. Theories are mostly important to provide a list of factors, 5 or 10 factors. But the theory itself does not have to give you a nice explanation over time. That's more the right-hand side of this figure, the process theory, where you have events and event sequences and struggles and powers and coalitions and learning and interpretation. That's more on the process theory side. That's not what variance theory is after, or statistical explanation, in my understanding. And it is useful to analyze particular sub-questions. As I said, for instance, the effect of the emissions trading scheme in Europe on corporate R&D strategies, or a paper from Sovokol and others. They just want to know, okay, let's look at preferences in the population about electric vehicles, who's likely to buy them, and let's see how that relates to age and income and where they live and how rich they are and what education they have and their gender. Not uninteresting, but it's a specific kind of sub question of what you want to explain. This is a very dominant way of thinking in the social sciences, and it has some validity and usefulness, I think, in transition studies, but it does not entirely do justice to the transition characteristics as set out in the beginning. So then the last view of explanation is more the generative explanation linked to critical realism. This really explains, well, an explanation is you need to show how an outcome is produced by interacting entities, causal mechanisms, and underlying structures. And how you operationalize that really needs to depend on the topic, the question, and the kind of causality that you want to use. There are probably cases where you can just use a simple linear chain of causation. But I think for most transitions, in particular whole transitions, you will have a long process with all these complex causalities that I mentioned, configurational, conjunctural, event chains. And I think those that way of explaining, the generative explanations, are useful for how questions. So you also need to be very aware there are different kind of questions that we can answer. Now you can frame questions like how much questions, like how much of something is explained by something else. You can ask why questions, or you can ask how questions. So there are different ways in which you can formulate your questions, and they have implications for the kind of philosophy of science that you mobilize. So Van Ven says how questions require a process theory explanation of the temporal order and sequence in which a discrete set of events occurred based on a story or historical narrative. So I think this way of thinking, this generative explanation, is particularly suited if you want to, how did this something happen? How did we move from the beginning to the end? What did the whole process look like? So it starts with the explanandum, what needs to be explained, and then you try to show how did this outcome, how was it generated? And Renate Mainz, who's a senior, well, really senior scholar in political science and historical sociology, said that this causal reconstruction, that's her terminology, does not look for statistical relationships among variables, but seeks to explain a given social phenomenon, which can be an event, a structure, or development, by identifying the processes through which it is generated. Causal reconstruction may lead to a more or less complex historical narrative, but in its theoretically more ambitious version, causal reconstruction aims at generalization. that involves processes, not correlations. So this is definitely a way of explanation and causality. It's just a different way, and also what you try to explain is different than some of the critics say. So what's the role of theory in this kind of explanation? Well, if you read that literature, they say theories provide the concepts of how you see the actors, the activities, and the structures that you can use in your explanation. Now, theory does not in itself give the explanation, which is almost what explanatory theory, which I think is a strange term, it almost assumes the theory gives the explanation of a particular transition. I see theory as a tool that you can use to give an explanation. You still need to do the empirical research of how the transition went in Germany or in the UK. The theory does not give you the answer to that. It gives you the tools and the concepts to do the analysis. And actually, if you read critical realism, I've got some of these quotes here. This is all critical realism. They all say theory is a lens or a tool or a heuristic. So I really, if these critics say, that's not how you do it, and they pretend to be drawn to critical realism, they just don't know the literature. All these critical realists say every theory is a lens for making sense of the world. We see and understand the world with the help of theories. So it's very common to see theory as a heuristic device that helps you to give explanations. And then some of them say, well, particularly for simple topics, you can do it with one theory that helps you explain, maybe baseballs breaking windows. But if you want to do more complex problems, and particularly if they get longer over time, this is what Van der Ven says, the more complex the problem, the greater the need to map this complexity by employing multiple and divergent models. And then Heritier says, with the increasing length of the chain of causation, the number of relevant and intervening variables increases. We have to link various partial theories in a modular construct to account for a complex political phenomenon. And then Little, he's written some really good books. This 2016 book is really fantastic. He says, a mature social science basically drops this whole idea of deductive positivist view. And he says, instead, we should have a few high-level generalizations. A mature social science would involve not a deductive theory with a few high-level generalizations and laws, but rather an eclectic ensemble of theories of mid-level processes and mechanisms. So I thought that was really interesting. And basically, that's how, you may agree or disagree, but that's how I see what the NLP is trying to do. That the niche regime landscape is basically a middle range framework. It's not so much a theory itself, but it can be filled in and operationalized with auxiliary theories. And these can be evolutionary economics or STS or institutional theory, as I elaborated somewhere else. But you can also use business studies, cultural studies, political science theories. And I think that's how I read what's happening in the field. Many people are mobilizing additional kind of theories to make causal linkages between niche regime landscape happen. So we've got a middle range framework, then we've got specific theories to help more dedicated explanations. And then I think we also already have a big toolbox of causal mechanisms that can help us provide more detailed analysis, fit and stretch patterns, selective translation. Adriaan Smith has done lots of interesting stuff, add-on mechanisms, hybridization mechanisms, hype disappointment cycles. I think we've got a whole big toolbox of causal mechanisms that we can use to give more detailed explanations. So that also means I've got a much more positive view of interdisciplinarity. So in the paper, I really tried to, Steve Sorrell says, the framework is already getting too complex and transition scholars, they should really stop elaborating an already over-complex theoretical framework. Because he's got in my view, a more positivist view. We need to focus on smaller topics, less theory, rigorous operationalization. That's fine, that's his style. I think if you take a more critical realist approach on theory and explanation, you would actually welcome more theories. But of course, the kind of theories you mobilize depend on the topic you want to explain. So the last slides, I think, as I said earlier,
we have now half an hour for discussion left, Brian, just FYI.
This is the last slide. economists, modelers, engineers, there's been a lot of normal science, epistemological criticism. As I said, transitions have got a special characteristics which require a particular style. I think many of these positivist and cause and effect approaches, they have some validity, but they really struggle to accommodate these styles. And I do feel a little bit they are reducing transitions. What is an interesting topic, they try to squeeze it into a positivist straitjacket. So instead, I try to advocate that if you take this broader kind of approach of thinking about causality and explanation, then actually there is a world to win. And I try to encourage people to take this opportunity to think creatively about their own work. And I ended with this quote also from a critical realist saying there's nothing wrong with normal science, but it becomes problematic when everyone does normal science and we cannot do the big questions anymore. And he's asking for more interdisciplinarity and creative thinking. And I think that's a nice call to end with.